August 1945. The desert air outside Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, shimmered with heat, yet inside the recreation hall, darkness settled like calm water. A film projector whirred at the back of the room, its beam cutting through cigarette smoke and dust. Hundreds of Japanese prisoners, men once trained to die before surrender, sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, their khaki uniforms faded by 2 years of sun and shame. On the canvas screen, Charlie Chaplin slipped, stumbled, and fell face first into a bucket of whitewash. For a moment, silence. Then a sound no guard expected. Laughter. Stifled at first, then full, uncontrolled. It rolled through the hall like thunder breaking a dam. Faces that had been blank for months now shook with mirth. Some men clutched their stomachs, others wiped tears they didn't understand. Outside, the American sergeant on duty paused at the doorway, listening to the foreign chorus of joy echoing through barbed wire. He didn't speak Japanese, but he understood what it meant. In a war built on hate and dehumanization, a flickering reel of film had done something extraordinary. It made enemies laugh together. By 1942, the Pacific had become the most brutal theater of the Second World War. Across coral islands and steaming jungles, the Imperial Japanese Army fought with an intensity born from indoctrination. To surrender was shame. To live after defeat was dishonor. Allied troops quickly learned that taking prisoners alive was rare, often dangerous. When they did, the captives came broken, silent, and haunted by their own survival. Yet the U.S. War Department, bound by the 1929 Geneva Convention, insisted that any prisoner who did survive be treated as a soldier, not a savage. As American forces advanced across Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Aleutians, the first small groups of Japanese captives were shipped east, first to Hawaii, then to the mainland. By late 1943, more than 5,000 Japanese POWs were scattered across a network of camps stretching from New Mexico to Wisconsin. The camps themselves were born of American efficiency. Rows of barracks built from pine, a perimeter of barbed wire, floodlights, guard towers, and beyond them, farmland. Inside, the prisoners lived under military precision. They rose at dawn, cleaned their quarters, performed work assignments, and gathered for roll calls punctuated by commands in English and broken Japanese. The contrast to the world they had left was jarring. These men had been trained to die for the Emperor. Many had watched comrades commit suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. They expected torture or execution. Instead, they were handed soap, blankets, and 3 meals a day. The office of the Provost Marshal General oversaw the system. Its instructions were clear. Treatment of all prisoners will reflect the standards of civilization. This was not generosity. It was strategy. Humane treatment served 2 purposes. It demonstrated America's moral strength and encouraged future surrenders in a war where every captured soldier meant 1 fewer death on the battlefield. For the prisoners themselves, the first months were steeped in disbelief. They refused to speak to guards, avoided eye contact, and spent long hours staring at the floor. Letters from captured officers show a profound confusion. "We are fed and clothed as equals," one wrote. "This is more frightening than punishment." American officials understood the psychological barrier at play. In Japan, wartime propaganda had portrayed Americans as beasts who murdered prisoners. The reality of discipline and order undermined that narrative. And so, in 1943, the War Department introduced a quiet experiment, education and recreation programs designed to demilitarize the mind. Books, language lessons, and cultural activities were introduced under supervision. At first, few participated. Japanese officers distrusted anything labeled re-education, seeing it as a trick. But boredom is a slow solvent, and isolation dulls defiance. By 1944, attendance at classes grew. Prisoners began learning English phrases, studying American geography, even sketching from magazines. Then, one evening at Camp McCoy, a portable projector arrived. The guard set up a screen in the dining hall. The title, "It Happened One Night." For many of the men watching, it was the first film they had ever seen, not sanctioned by the Imperial Army. The story, a romantic comedy about two Americans arguing, joking, and falling in love, was incomprehensible in words, but captivating in motion. They watched Clark Gable and Claudette Colbert banter and bicker, their freedom of expression almost alien. The room stayed quiet, but something shifted. They had seen a nation not through gun barrels, but through laughter. Over the following months, screenings became routine. Newsreels, cartoons, and comedies circulated between camps, arriving with the same regularity as medical inspections or mail. What began as an experiment in psychological warfare evolved into something more profound. Inside barbed wire, America was teaching its captives not ideology, but humanity. And the more those reels flickered across the walls of the camps, the more they revealed the strange power of a story to outshine hate. The idea of showing movies to enemy prisoners began as a bureaucratic footnote buried in the paperwork of wartime psychology. In early 1944, the Office of War Information, OWI, and the Special Projects Division of the War Department collaborated on what they called orientation through observation. The premise was simple: show captured Japanese soldiers what democracy looked like, not through speeches or pamphlets, but through moving pictures. To the American mind, Hollywood was the most persuasive instrument of all. It could make a point without saying it directly. A screwball comedy or a musical could display gender equality, humor, leisure, and even dissent, concepts banned in Imperial Japan's militarized society. Every frame was a quiet lecture in freedom. Camps like Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico, and Camp Kennedy, Texas, soon received mobile film units. Projectors, screens, and reels were shipped from Army distribution centers. The screenings were supervised by guards and interpreters, but intentionally informal. Attendance was voluntary. And yet, after the first few weeks, halls were full. The first films were chosen carefully: light entertainment, minimal dialogue, no overt politics. Chaplin's Modern Times, City Lights, and the silent shorts of Laurel and Hardy became favorites because humor required no translation. When a man slipped on a banana peel, the room laughed in unison. For a brief moment, rank and nationality dissolved, but the emotional reaction went deeper than amusement. For soldiers raised under state propaganda, laughter itself felt forbidden. The Imperial Japanese Army had drilled solemnity into its men since adolescence: discipline, silence, unquestioning obedience. In camp diaries later collected by historians, one prisoner wrote, "My mouth hurt from smiling. I had forgotten that muscles could do that." American officers noticed the transformation. Behavioral reports from Camp McCoy describe a visible decline in hostility and depression following regular entertainment nights. Guards reported that prisoners began volunteering for English classes, requested American newspapers, and even asked to help with the projection equipment. The Army psychologists saw measurable results in morale, but for the men themselves, something more intimate was happening. Laughter became memory. Some wept quietly during the films. When Gone with the Wind was screened in early 1945, several prisoners broke down. The grandeur of its imagery, cities burning, soldiers returning home, mirrored the fate awaiting their own country. "We watched the destruction of Atlanta," one recalled years later, "and saw Tokyo." To the U.S. command, these screenings were tools of rehabilitation. To the men inside those rooms, they were glimpses of an alien world, one where individuality could exist without punishment. Guards sometimes joined in, leaning against walls during comedies, smiling at the same gags. Mutual humanity slipped through the cracks of command. This human connection startled both sides. An interpreter at Camp Kennedy remembered translating audience reactions for officers. Prisoners debated whether the women on screen were strong or shameless, whether the heroes were foolish or free. Through film, they encountered democracy not as propaganda, but as culture, messy, emotional, imperfect, alive. Outside the fences, American newspapers barely mentioned these programs. The public still viewed Japan through the lens of Pearl Harbor and atrocity. But within the camps, the War Department's strategy quietly worked. Defiance gave way to reflection. Reports of violence dropped sharply. Interrogators found prisoners more willing to talk about their experiences. And gradually, the screenings changed purpose. What began as psychological leverage became a rare act of shared humanity. Guards, nurses, interpreters, and prisoners began sitting together, each seeing in the other's laughter a reflection of something beyond nationality. By 1945, that fragile bridge of sound and light had become one of the war's strangest miracles, entertainment as empathy. And as the war drew toward its devastating close, those nights of flickering light would lead to one of the most powerful turning points in captivity, the moment when laughter and tears blurred and the enemy began to see not conquerors, but people. The psychological shock of humanity. For Japanese prisoners, the greatest dissonance wasn't the fences or the guards, it was kindness. The imperial code had prepared them for pain, not mercy. Captivity was supposed to be humiliation. Instead, they were treated with structure and routine. The emotional impact was staggering. In interviews decades later, many recalled that the first real rupture in their fear came not from food or letters, but from laughter. When the Americans made jokes, one former soldier said, "We thought it was a trap. Then they laughed too, and nothing happened." It was the first time some had seen authority paired with humor. The War Department's psychologists recognized this. They described laughter as a deconditioning tool. It broke the ritual seriousness drilled into the men since youth. When a Chaplin reel played, the absurdity of clumsy police or chaotic factory workers shattered the image of the flawless hierarchy they had been raised to obey. The laughter that followed wasn't rebellion. It was release. Some prisoners confessed later that it was also guilt. To laugh under captivity felt like betrayal. One diary found at Camp Lordsburg read, "We laughed until we remembered who we were. Then some of us cried." That duality, joy tangled with shame, was the precise space where rehumanization began. The cultural encounter with freedom for Americans, Hollywood was familiar. For Japanese soldiers, it was revelation. They had grown up under films tightly censored by the Imperial Home Ministry, military newsreels, patriotic dramas, heroic sacrifice. In those stories, individuality always bowed to the emperor. At Camp McCoy, they saw something unimaginable: women defying men, workers mocking bosses, ordinary citizens pursuing happiness. They watched His Girl Friday, The Philadelphia Story, The Wizard of Oz, a parade of color, motion, and emotion utterly foreign to their world. Even black and white comedies felt vivid because they depicted chaos without punishment. One POW later described The Wizard of Oz as a dream from another planet. The Tin Man's longing for a heart, the Scarecrow's wish for a brain. These were metaphors that transcended translation. In a society where emotions were often suppressed, this freedom to feel openly struck deep. Guards reported that after screenings, prisoners would gather outside under the floodlights, quietly discussing what they had seen. "The American woman is strong," one said. "She speaks her mind. In Japan, that is impossible." Another observed, "They laugh at leaders, and no one is shot." To the Americans, these remarks were evidence of successful indoctrination. To the prisoners, they were glimpses of an unfamiliar moral order, one where laughter didn't mean disrespect and freedom wasn't chaos. The operational precision behind the screens. Beneath the emotional layers was an intricate machine of logistics and control. Each screening followed detailed Army guidelines, reels logged, equipment inspected, attendance recorded. Censorship officers previewed every film to remove anti-Japanese caricatures or scenes deemed inflammatory. The goal was persuasion, not humiliation. In Camp Kennedy, projection duty rotated among guards who received weekly shipments of reels from the War Department's Motion Picture Exchange. The program blended propaganda newsreels with entertainment. One evening might open with a short about Allied progress in Europe and close with modern times. POWs never saw combat footage involving Japan, a deliberate omission meant to protect fragile morale. The screenings also served an intelligence purpose. Psychologists watched reactions closely, noting which scenes drew laughter or discomfort. When prisoners responded strongly to themes of poverty or injustice, officers recognized an opportunity. Show them that America's society admitted flaws and still functioned. The films became quiet lessons in resilience. By 1945, the system was operating with near-industrial precision. Each camp reported morale statistics, measured productivity and work details, and correlated behavior improvements with entertainment exposure. The data confirmed what intuition already knew: humor pacified hostility more effectively than punishment. But beneath the numbers, something unquantifiable was growing: the very act of sitting together. Guards and prisoners alike, watching the same story, blurred boundaries that years of war had drawn in blood. A shared laugh became a subtle acknowledgement. Whatever separated them outside the theater, inside they were simply human beings, reacting to light and sound. That fragile thread of shared humanity was powerful and dangerous. For in the final year of the war, as the Pacific turned toward its fiery climax, those same screens would reflect an even more painful truth: that laughter could coexist with loss, and compassion could survive even Hiroshima. The moral dimension: laughter as a form of surrender. For most of the Japanese prisoners, laughter felt foreign, almost treasonous. They had been taught that emotion, especially joy, belonged only to the emperor's victories. But in the flickering dark of the camp theater, those lessons unraveled. Each burst of laughter became a small act of rebellion against indoctrination, a letting go of fear. A POW who later became a schoolteacher in Tokyo described it years afterward. "When I laughed at Chaplin, something inside broke and something else was born. I realized that I was alive." To laugh in defeat was to admit the possibility of life beyond duty. To American officers observing from the back of the hall, those smiles were data points, proof that the demilitarization project was working. To the men themselves, it was more profound. Laughter became surrender without humiliation, a way to acknowledge loss while reclaiming humanity. In that sense, the screenings were not propaganda, but therapy. They replaced fanatic obedience with self-awareness, a shift far deeper than command anticipated. Each chuckle in the dark was the sound of the war's ideology slowly collapsing. The propaganda and re-education vision. Behind the humanity, there remained calculation. The U.S. government saw these cultural programs as tools of long-term influence. If the Axis soldiers of today could be shown that American democracy offered dignity instead of domination, perhaps tomorrow's Japan would be less hostile. The War Department's Psychological Warfare Branch studied post-screening behavior meticulously. Reports noted that POWs exposed to American films showed greater interest in English, requested newspapers, and volunteered for farm work. A memo dated March 1945 concluded, Entertainment facilitates rehabilitation through identification. The phrase meant that by empathizing with movie characters, prisoners began to internalize democratic ideals. This approach, gentle, indirect, cultural, was the seed of what would later be called soft power. The strategy foreshadowed the same methods the U.S. would use in post-war occupation and Reconstruction, influence through exposure rather than coercion. Still, it was not free of irony. The same Hollywood that humanized America for its captives also produced propaganda caricaturing Japan's people. Those reels were never shown inside the camps, but the contradiction remained, a reminder that even moral victories were complex. Nevertheless, within the walls of McCoy and Lordsburg, the policy worked. Interrogators recorded rising cooperation, fewer discipline problems, and, most tellingly, changes in language. The word enemy appeared less in prisoner correspondence. Phrases like, "The Americans are strange but fair," appeared more often. Through laughter, indoctrination yielded to curiosity. The human bridge shared silence. After the joke. Perhaps the most haunting image of all came not from laughter, but from what followed it, the silence after the reels ended. Guards and prisoners would file out together into the cold night air. For a few minutes, the usual tension dissolved. The barbed wire still stood, the guns still gleamed, but between them lingered a fragile peace. A corporal stationed at Camp Kennedy recalled one night when the projector jammed. While technicians fumbled with the reel, a prisoner stepped forward and began miming Chaplin's tramp walk to entertain the crowd. Both sides burst out laughing. "For that moment," the corporal said, "I forgot which side of the fence I was on." Moments like that didn't make headlines. They weren't medals or victories, yet they carried a quiet permanence. In those improvised theaters, humanity rehearsed reconciliation long before diplomats ever signed it, and as the war neared its end, the laughter began to change. It grew softer, sadder, weighted by news from the Pacific, of Okinawa, of Tokyo burning, of atomic clouds. Some nights the men didn't laugh at all. They simply watched, eyes wet, as images of ordinary American life passed before them. Families at picnics, lovers in parks, children waving flags. For the first time, they saw not an enemy, but a possible future. When the lights came up, no one clapped. They bowed slightly, to the guards, to the screen, to something they couldn't yet name. That was the moment when laughter became understanding, and understanding became the first step toward peace. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War was burning toward its end. Tokyo lay in ruins, Okinawa was a slaughterhouse, and the emperor's once infallible image had begun to crack. Inside America's detention camps, thousands of Japanese prisoners, cut off from news, uncertain whether their homeland still existed, waited in a strange limbo between defeat and disbelief. At Camp McCoy, the recreation hall had become their only window to another world. Every Saturday night, guards rolled in the heavy steel projector and unspooled another reel from the War Department's film exchange. Comedies remained the most popular, but the tone of the screenings had begun to shift. The laughter, once unrestrained, was quieter now, tempered by fatigue and the growing sense that the war was slipping away. One night in June 1945, a new film arrived, The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin. The irony was immediate. Japanese prisoners watching a British-born comedian mock Adolf Hitler and fascism, systems once allied with their own empire. When Chaplin's parody of a tyrant erupted into slapstick chaos, the hall filled with hesitant chuckles. But as the film approached its final speech, his plea for humanity and kindness, the laughter stilled. Dozens of men sat motionless, eyes fixed on the trembling black and white figure, declaring, "We all want to help one another. Human beings are like that." A translator, seated near the projector, whispered a rough Japanese rendering of the speech. Some prisoners wept openly, others turned their faces away. The guards, too, fell silent. One later wrote in his log, "Tonight the war felt far away." That screening became legend among the camp's inhabitants. The next morning, the Japanese interpreter requested a transcript of the film's closing lines to translate and post on the barracks wall. It was allowed. Within a week, fragments of Chaplin's words were copied in notebooks, passed between prisoners as quiet tokens of hope. In those few hours of projected light, decades of indoctrination had cracked. Men raised to believe that compassion was weakness now saw it portrayed as courage. A handful began to volunteer for interviews with American officers, expressing curiosity about the country they had once sworn to destroy. One prisoner reportedly said, "If this man speaks for America, then perhaps America is not our enemy." At Camp Kennedy in Texas, similar scenes unfolded. A screening of The Grapes of Wrath stunned the audience. The film's depiction of poverty and injustice shattered the propaganda image of America as a decadent utopia. Prisoners saw that even a victorious nation admitted suffering, and that its people could criticize their own leaders without fear. That discovery, for many, was more shocking than defeat itself. Psychologists observing from the back of the hall took notes. Their reports confirmed what the laughter had suggested months earlier, that exposure to unfiltered humanity dissolved fear more effectively than ideology. Compassion, humor, and vulnerability, once considered weaknesses, were transforming into instruments of influence. But none of this was planned to feel emotional. To the Army, it was still an experiment, a line item in a bureaucratic table labeled re-education efficacy. To the men in those seats, it was revelation. In the darkness, surrounded by fences and guards, they had glimpsed something Japan's militarism had denied them: the freedom to feel. After the great dictator, behavior inside the camps changed subtly but unmistakably. Prisoners began bowing to guards during a roll call. English phrases appeared in their daily interactions. "Good morning," "Thank you," "How are you?" Small linguistic gestures that baffled visiting inspectors. Work details ran smoother, incidents of self-harm dropped sharply, and for the first time, prisoners requested Bibles, dictionaries, and literature. The War Department noted the shift, but did not fully grasp its scale. What had begun as psychological conditioning had evolved into cultural awakening. Laughter had turned to reflection, and reflection to empathy. Then came August 1945. News of Hiroshima reached the camps slowly, filtered through radio bulletins and cautious translators. The laughter that once filled the recreation halls vanished overnight. But in that silence, another realization emerged. The Americans who had destroyed their cities were the same people who had made them laugh. The emotional contradiction was unbearable and transformative. For the first time, many of the men understood the magnitude of what the world had become. And within those fences, they began to feel not hatred, but a kind of grief mixed with reluctant respect. The next screenings would no longer be about laughter. They would become vigils for a changing world, where images on a screen taught lessons no battlefield ever could. August 1945. The world changed in a single flash. When the guards at Camp McCoy announced that an atomic bomb had been dropped on Hiroshima, the prisoners stood in stunned silence. Many refused to believe it. Some prayed aloud, others demanded proof. A few collapsed where they stood, whispering the names of their families. Within days, Nagasaki followed, and the Emperor's surrender broadcast reached even the most remote compounds in the American heartland. For the prisoners, the sound of Emperor Hirohito's voice over shortwave radio, calm, sorrowful, surrendering, was the shattering of an entire universe. These were men trained to die rather than yield. Now their godlike sovereign had told them to live. Inside the camps, order held, but grief hung like fog. At Camp Lordsburg, guards reported that many prisoners requested to be alone. They walked the perimeter fences for hours, heads bowed, speaking softly to one another. When evening came, the Americans made an unexpected decision. They would still hold movie night. The projector was rolled in, and on the reel that night was Meet John Doe, Frank Capra's story of an ordinary man manipulated by politics but redeemed by compassion. As the first reel flickered to life, a hush fell over the hall. The story's themes, corruption, despair, the search for hope, felt uncannily timely. When Gary Cooper's character climbed the building rooftop in the final act, threatening to end his life, the prisoners leaned forward. Then came the turning point, a crowd below pleading with him not to jump, reminding him that one man's faith could redeem many. The hall was silent except for the hum of the projector. When the credits rolled, no one moved. Then quietly, a single prisoner began to clap. Others joined. The sound swelled, not jubilation, but reverence. Some men were crying. One guard later wrote in his diary, "It wasn't applause for the film. It was for being human again." Across the camps, similar scenes played out in those final days. The men who had laughed months earlier at Chaplin now sat weeping through dramas of compassion and loss. The laughter had softened into understanding. For the first time, they were processing the war not as soldiers, but as survivors. In Camp McCoy, an interpreter named Satoru Yamasaki translated the surrender speech aloud for the men who couldn't understand the emperor's words through static. He ended by saying simply, "The war is over. We are all men again." Then, without orders, the prisoners stood, bowed deeply toward the American officers, and returned to their barracks in silence. That night, the final film shown before repatriation was It's a Wonderful Life. The irony was not lost on anyone. The movie had just been released in American theaters, a story about despair, hope, and rediscovering the value of a single life. As James Stewart's voice echoed through the hall, "No man is a failure who has friends," dozens of Japanese prisoners wept openly. A few reached out to shake hands with the guards at the exit. The War Department's psychologists could not have scripted a more poignant finale. Their reports later described a complete inversion of morale. The enemy soldiers who once viewed surrender as shame now saw mercy as strength. The following weeks were filled with preparation for repatriation. The camp theaters were dismantled, projectors boxed up, screens rolled tight. But their work was already done. The reels had carried something far greater than propaganda. They had delivered empathy. Many prisoners requested photographs of the theaters as keepsakes. One wrote a note in careful English. "Please remember, we laughed with you, and in that laughter, we saw your hearts." When the ships departed from Seattle and San Francisco in 1946, taking thousands of former prisoners back to a devastated homeland, many carried those memories as their most precious possession. Some would later join post-war friendship associations, exchange letters with their former guards, or become advocates for cultural understanding. In a war remembered for cruelty and division, the spectacle of laughter and tears inside barbed wire remained one of its quietest miracles. It was proof that even amid total war, humanity could flicker, projected, fragile, but bright enough to reach across nations. The war's end did not bring chaos to the Japanese prisoner of war camps in America. Instead, it brought an odd serenity, a kind of melancholy order. The men who had once sat rigid in defiance now moved through daily routines with quiet discipline. They no longer sang imperial hymns at dawn or refused to speak to guards. Instead, they queued patiently for roll call, cleaned their barracks, and waited for word of return. The Provost Marshal General's office initiated a massive repatriation program in late 1945. By train and ship, thousands of Japanese POWs were transported to ports in California and Washington, bound for a homeland they scarcely recognized. But before departure, each man underwent a final medical examination and debriefing. Army doctors inspected their health, psychologists recorded interviews. Among the most surprising findings was the emotional tone of the prisoners. Rather than bitterness, there was gratitude and curiosity. One report from Camp McCoy described the atmosphere succinctly. Captives express astonishment at humane treatment and appear reflective rather than resentful. The same report noted that many asked about post-war American life, industry, and family customs. Several requested dictionaries and magazines to continue learning English during the voyage home. Many also asked about movies. One interpreter recalled being approached by a former Japanese sergeant clutching a notebook of English phrases. He pointed to a line he had written phonetically, "John Doe, not die." It was his way of saying thank you. In camp archives and oral histories collected decades later, countless testimonies echoed this sentiment. "We expected anger," one ex-prisoner said, "but we were shown laughter. That was more powerful." Another remembered the faces of the American guards illuminated by the same projector light that touched his own. "We were enemies no longer, just men watching the same dream." The Americans, too, carried those memories home. Many guards and medical officers spoke later of how the prisoners' reactions had humanized the conflict for them. Sergeant Harold Lang of Wisconsin recalled, "I never thought I'd see a Japanese man laugh. Then I realized we were laughing at the same thing." For U.S. officials, the experiment's success became a quiet triumph of psychological warfare. Reports sent to Washington claimed that entertainment had achieved what interrogation could not, the moral disarmament of a defeated enemy. Yet outside the bureaucracy, few Americans ever heard of it. The program was overshadowed by the bombings, the trials, and the Reconstruction. Still, its effects rippled beyond the wire. Many returning prisoners became early supporters of Japan's democratization under the U.S. occupation. Some joined local councils promoting cooperation with Allied authorities. A few even cited specific films they had seen in captivity, The Grapes of Wrath, Meet John Doe, Modern Times, as the first lessons in what freedom meant. To them, America was no longer the faceless invader. It was the land of laughter that could coexist with strength. That realization softened the cultural ground for reconciliation long before any treaty was signed. And for the men and women who had made those screenings possible, the projectionists, translators, nurses, and guards, the reward was intangible but lasting. They had proven that a nation's character could be measured not only by the wars it fought, but by the dignity it showed when the fighting was done. The reels were silent now, but the light they cast lingered on the faces of all who had seen it, reminding both sides that civilization, like cinema, depended on how clearly one could see another human being. When the last POW ships departed from Seattle and San Francisco in the spring of 1946, the War Department believed the chapter was closed. The camps were dismantled, the projectors boxed away, the reports filed into archives. But history was not finished with the experiment. In the years that followed, the memories of those screenings traveled home with the men who had once sat behind barbed wire. Japan was a ruin then, its cities scorched, its economy shattered, its people bewildered by defeat and occupation. Yet scattered among the rubble were thousands of returning soldiers who carried, in their minds, fragments of another world, the images of laughing Americans, stories of resilience, films where ordinary people defied despair. Many of those men became teachers, writers, or community leaders during the occupation. They told stories of the Eigaken, the cinema halls of the camps, and how the films had shown them that strength and kindness could coexist. Some organized local film clubs showing American movies to students for the first time. In post-war memoirs, they described those screenings not as propaganda, but as revelation. We saw America's heart beating in light. U.S. occupation authorities recognized this unexpected bridge. General Douglas MacArthur's Civil Information and Education section began importing hundreds of Hollywood films to Japan as part of its democratization campaign. Chaplin, Capra, and Ford became household names. The laughter that had begun inside detention camps now echoed across theaters from Yokohama to Osaka. Historians would later call it the dawn of American soft power, the subtle influence of culture shaping perception more effectively than weapons ever could. The emotional groundwork had been laid by the POW screenings. Laughter had become diplomacy. The humanitarian dimension also endured. Reports from the Geneva Convention committees cited the U.S. treatment of Japanese POWs as a model of lawful conduct, particularly given Japan's own violations in Asia. This moral contrast strengthened America's post-war position and became a cornerstone of its international image. For the first time, compassion had strategic value. Within the United States, few civilians knew how deeply the policy had mattered. The official films and photos of the camps remained classified or forgotten until the 1980s, when historians uncovered them in military archives. Grainy footage showed rows of Japanese prisoners laughing, Chaplin's silhouette flickering across their faces. Those images stunned modern viewers, a reminder that even in the most polarized conflict of the century, empathy had found room to breathe. By then, many of the former prisoners had passed away. But those who remained often spoke of the screenings as a turning point not just in captivity, but in conscience. One former soldier interviewed in 1984 summed it simply, "They gave us movies, and we learned what freedom looks like when people are laughing." That statement carried a truth larger than any victory parade. In war, nations measure power by destruction. In peace, by the capacity to rebuild trust. The light from those camp projectors had done both. It destroyed fear and built curiosity. As decades passed, Japan's own film industry blossomed into one of the world's most influential producing directors like Kurosawa and Ozu, artists who explored themes of humanity, morality, and resilience, first glimpsed through those Hollywood reels in captivity. The legacy came full circle, a cultural exchange born in confinement that would later enrich the world's cinema. The fences, the guards, the camps themselves have long vanished. But the laughter remains, preserved in memoirs, archives, and film. It is the sound of two nations learning, through stories, what war had tried to make them forget. That to see one another clearly is the first step toward peace. History often records its victories in explosions, the thunder of artillery, the roar of bombers, the signatures on surrender papers. But sometimes, the truest measure of a nation's power flickers in silence, a reel of light spinning in the dark, illuminating the faces of its former enemies. Inside those U.S. detention camps, laughter had done what bullets never could. It had crossed the boundaries of ideology, fear, and language. The Japanese prisoners who once bowed only to the emperor found themselves bowing to something else, the absurdity, compassion, and freedom of human imperfection. The nurses who tended them, the guards who threaded the projectors, the officers who followed protocol, none could have predicted that their simple act of showing movies would ripple through history. Yet in that small, unheralded policy lay one of the war's most profound lessons. That empathy, when disciplined by order, can dismantle hate more effectively than any weapon. For the prisoners, those nights were the first glimpses of a world without propaganda, where people laughed at power and still respected it, where weakness could exist without shame. For the Americans, it was a mirror, revealing that mercy was not softness, but strategy. the ability to defeat an enemy without destroying his soul. When the lights came up and the reels spun down, the men returned to their barracks different. They had seen not American dominance, but American humanity, projected, flickering, imperfect, real. Years later, when those men built families and futures in a new Japan, they remembered the laughter that had filled those dark halls. Some said it was the first sound of peace, and perhaps it was, because long after the guns fell silent, that light still shone, proof that even in the age of total war, civilization could survive, one shared story at a time.